The story goes like this. In a town near the edge of Yugoslavia in the years after the First World War, men had a way of disappearing. Not the town's own men. Strangers mostly. Travellers, salesmen, young men passing through, the kind nobody misses quickly. They were last seen in the company of a wealthy young widow who lived in an old chateau outside the town. She was, everyone agreed, the most beautiful woman anyone had ever seen there. And then one day, a banker's wife walked into the police station and refused to leave. Her husband had gone to visit the widow, she said, and he had not come back. The police knew the rumours. This time, there was a name attached, and a wife who would not stop asking. So they went out to the chateau. To reach its cellar, the story says, they had to pass through long vaulted corridors of stone and break down 3 iron doors, while an old servant woman fought them so fiercely they put her in handcuffs. Then they stood in the dark, in the last cellar, and raised their electric torches. Arranged neatly around the room stood 35 zinc coffins. On the lid of each coffin, a label, a man's name, his age, and how long he had been hers. 2 husbands, 32 lovers, and 1 coffin with the name of her 10-year-old son. In the middle of the room, facing the coffins, stood a single armchair. It was hers. She would sit there, the story says, on quiet evenings, among the men who could never leave her again. That is the story. It has been printed for 100 years in a dozen countries under one name, Vera Renczi, the Black Widow, the deadliest woman who ever lived. And after 100 years, there is still one thing nobody has ever managed to do. Nobody has ever found the woman who did it. First, one small thing. If cases like this one deserve to be remembered properly, subscribe, leave a like, and say in the comments where you first heard of the Black Widow. It matters more than usual today, because you may well have heard of her. By the internet's count, Vera Renczi is the most prolific female serial killer in history. 35 victims, every one of them poisoned with arsenic, every one of them a man who loved her. Romania's biggest history magazine ranks her the #1 serial killer the country ever produced. Her story runs in English, Polish, Romanian, Serbian, Czech, and Portuguese. Her biggest single telling has 1/3 listens. She has a face you may recognize, a dark-eyed portrait that sits on thumbnails and listicles everywhere, and she has a catchphrase the internet wrote across that face. If I cannot have them, no one will. The details vary, teller to teller. In some versions, her first husband is an Austrian banker named Karl Schick. In some, the son in the cellar is named Lorenzo. In some, the coffins stand in a circle with candles and a bottle of champagne beside the chair. But every version, in every language, agrees on the shape. The beauty, the arsenic, the cellar, the 35 labelled coffins, the armchair, and a confession in a jealous whisper. And every version, in every language, if you follow its sources back far enough, walks through the same narrow door. A few columns of American newsprint printed in a single season, in the spring and summer of 1925. That season is where Vera Renczi begins. It is also, as far as any record on Earth can show, where she ends. On Tuesday, May the 19th, 1925, the front pages of Small City America carried a strange item from Europe. In Utica, New York, the evening paper headlined it, "Woman is held for poisoning of 35 persons." In Pennsylvania, it ran as "A modern Borgia found," after Lucretia Borgia, the Renaissance princess whom legend turned into Rome's great poisoner. The item came from the wire services of William Randolph Hearst's press empire, the yellow press machine of the age. It was a few hundred words long. It is the founding document of everything in the opening minutes of this video. The wire said this: in a place it spelled Berkakul in Serbia, preliminary hearings had begun against a Madame Renczi, a Romanian, aged 30, beautiful as a picture. She was charged with poisoning 2 husbands, a 10-year-old son, and 32 suitors, 35 people in all, with arsenic. She had preserved the bodies, the wire said, by hermetically sealing them in zinc cans stored in her cellar, and on each big can she had written the name and age of the victim and the length of time he was her lover. 14 of them, the wire specified, were Romanians, and she had confessed. Asked why, the paper quoted her answer: out of jealousy, for I know that tomorrow they would run after another woman. So I said to myself, they had better sleep quietly in my cellar, without having to excite themselves. The boy had died, police were quoted as saying, because he had learned what stood in the cellar. 3 days later, a fuller version ran, datelined Berlin, and this one carried a byline: O.B. Tolicius of Hearst's Berlin Bureau, a reporter whose name would one day sit under journalism's Pulitzer Prize. His version called her the greatest female Bluebeard of modern times, after the fairy tale husband who murdered his wives and kept them behind a locked door. Her suitors, he wrote, were all between 23 and 30, and each had lasted 6 to 7 months of the greatest harmony and happiness, until the loved one would suddenly disappear. Read those columns closely, though, and notice what is not in them. There is no Vera. She is only Madame Renczi, no first name given. There are no coffins. There are cans, hermetically sealed, the kind of word a grocer would use. There is no chateau, no armchair, no candlelight. No husband has a name. And there is no trial, no verdict, no sentence. Only preliminary hearings somewhere far away, in a town spelled in a way no map has ever spelled anything. "11 weeks later, on Sunday, August the 2nd, the story came back, transformed. The American weekly was Hearst Sunday magazine, folded into newspapers from coast to coast, a full-page factory of marvels. Its page 5 that morning was headlined, "A Real Mrs. Bluebeard, Strange Tragedy of the Jealous Beauty and Her 35 Unlucky Sweethearts." Date-lined Paris. And in its opening lines, the woman from the wire received the gift no record office ever gave her. A name: Madame Vera Renczi. It is this single Sunday page that built almost everything the internet now remembers. The zinc cans became 35 zinc coffins, neatly arranged around the cellar, each bearing the name and age of the occupant. All the occupants, the page noted, were males. The cellar acquired an ancient chateau above it, with long vaulted corridors and 3 iron doors, and the old servant who fought the police. The dead banker got the only victim name ever printed, Leo Pacic, and a jealous wife who forced the search. Vera got a childhood. Born in Bucharest, it said, she poisoned her own dog as a little girl and explained to her horrified father, "Because I do not want my dog to belong to anybody else. When he leaves me, he leaves this world." She got a hunting ritual, the town cafes at 11 at night, the mysterious huntress, as the page called her, letting her brown eyes rest on a stranger once every 5 minutes until he could no longer resist. She got the confession in its final, quotable form. They were men, I could not endure the thought that they would ever put their arms around another woman after they had embraced me. And for her son, a line of pure theatre. He was a man too. Soon he would have held another woman in his arms. One answer of hers, printed that Sunday, never made it into the retellings. Asked at first why there were 35 bodies in her cellar, she did not whisper about jealousy. She said, "They are friends and relations whom I have cared for. Some of them were townspeople who were killed by the Germans when they passed through this place. A war-dead alibi." Every modern teller drops that line, because a woman making excuses is not a femme fatale. Keep it in mind. It is the first small crack in the marble. At the top of the page, beside the headline, the editors placed a photograph. A young woman in a bare-shouldered gown, pearls at her throat, her hair swept up under a wide band, gazing down and away. The caption reads, "Madame Vera Renczi, a real Mrs. Bluebeard, who has at last confessed to her many murders. Hold on to her face. It has a part to play later. After that Sunday, the American story simply stops. No trial was ever reported. No verdict. No sentence. No prison. No death. The most prolific murderess in history enters the world's press mid-air twice and never lands." A real murder case throws off paper the way a fire throws off smoke. Arrest warrants, indictments, trial transcripts, prison rolls, a grave. So the first question is simple. Where did Vera Renczi end up? Open the books and the internet, and you get an answer. 5 of them. The English Encyclopedia article says she was sentenced to life and died in prison in 1960 in Zrenjanin. Romania's history magazine says she died in prison after 3 years at only 32. Romanian dailies say she ended in an asylum on the eve of the Second World War. A Romanian correspondent once dated her death precisely to 1939 in a mental institute on the strength of documents no one has ever seen. A 5th version blends the others. Prison, a cerebral hemorrhage, date unknown. 5 confident endings. Not one of them carries a document. There is even a memorial page for her on a gravesite database. Born 1903, died 1960. Cause of death filled in. It was created by a user for a woman with no grave. Genealogists went looking too. No Karl Schick, the supposed Austrian banker husband, appears in the records they searched. The one Joseph Renczi they found died in the 1960s, decades after the legend says she poisoned him. The birth year most tellings give, 1903, collapses on its own arithmetic. It would make her 22 years old in 1925, with 35 murders behind her and a 10-year-old son in the cellar. Even the encyclopedia article that prints the date flags it as impossible. Then there is the town. Berkekul does not exist and never has. The real candidate behind the spelling is Veliki Bekarec, the market town of the Serbian Banat, renamed Petrovgrad in the 30s, called Zrenjanin today. It was no backwater, it had a courthouse, and it had newspapers, a Hungarian-language daily called Torontal, and a German-language weekly. And the capital's paper of record, Politica, has been digitized back to 1904. A chemistry professor at the University of Belgrade, Simon Jarmati, who has spent years on the history of poisoning in the Banat, went through all of it. The historical archives, the court records, Politica for 1925, and both of the town's own papers. He put his conclusion on the record in the Belgrade Daily Danas in one sentence. Vera Renczi is invented. In no relevant source, he said, is there a single letter about her. the wider sweep agrees with him. A full text search of the region's digitized Hungarian language press returns 2,278 articles about poisoners between 1925 and 1930. The Banat's newspapers could not get enough of poisoners. The name Vera Renczi appears in none of them. Not in 1925, not in the 30s, not once in the entire socialist era. On the English Wikipedia, after 15 years of editors fighting over her, the article now sits in a category reserved for a special kind of person, people whose existence is disputed. Which leaves the face. The dark-eyed portrait on all those thumbnails is real. It is a genuine photograph of a real woman. Researchers matched it, pixel for pixel, to its original, and the original has a name: Vera Fyodorovna Komisarjevskaya. She was one of the greatest Russian stage actresses of her generation. She created the role of Nina in the disastrous premiere of Chekhov's Seagull in 1896. She founded her own theatre in St. Petersburg in 1904. She died of smallpox on tour in Tashkent in 1910, 15 years before the legend was born, and her funeral filled the streets. The Soviet Union put her on a postage stamp. One of St. Petersburg's major theatres carries her name tonight. The internet, meanwhile, shows her face under a murderer's name, shrunk to a thumbnail the size of a postage stamp, and under one such portrait, a commenter cooed, "She's so cute." A second circulating Renczi portrait turns out to be the same actress, in the same striped dress, from the same sitting. She is not alone. In 2012, a British tabloid printed a supplement on women who kill, and the photograph it ran for Vera Renczi was a self-portrait that a living fashion model, Patricia Belda Martinez, had posted online in 2004. The paper printed an apology to her. The photograph is still, today, the face of the Black Widow on some of the biggest tellings on the internet. Other candidates have drifted through the legend over the years. A portrait of the American murderess Belle Gunness, a photograph from an unrelated Florida case. Whatever face was needed, the legend borrowed. And it had been borrowing from the start. Go back to that Sunday page from August 1925, the page that named her, and look again at the photograph beside the headline: the pearls, the bandeau, the downcast eyes. That woman is not the actress. She is not the model. She matches no portrait in the legend's whole century of faces, and she has never been identified. On the very first day that the name Vera Renczi appeared in print, the picture above it already belonged to somebody else. So the archives are silent. The endings contradict each other. The arithmetic fails. The town cannot be spelled, and every face was borrowed. The experts say invented. The record says invented. Invented from nothing. Almost nothing. For 100 years, everyone who went looking for her asked the archives the same question: where is Vera Renczi? And for 100 years, the archives answered, there is no such person. The question nobody asked is the other one. Never mind the name. Was there a woman in that town in those years held for poisoning her family with arsenic? Put that question to the digitized press of the region, and the silence ends instantly. 76 headlines come back. A real investigation, a real trial, real graves in Veliki Bekarek in exactly those months. Her name, depending on which paper you read and in which language, was printed half a dozen different ways. And that detail is about to matter more than anything else in this story. Call her what her family called her. Call her Julka. Julka was born around 1883 in a Banat village, and orphaned at 10. She married an innkeeper named Keglevich in the village of Perles, bore a daughter Sophia, and was widowed at the start of 1914. She moved to Bekarek and, in time, became the third wife of a widowed tradesman named Nikola Relic, a man with two half-grown sons of his own, Milivoy and Borivoy. She was not 30, and there was no chateau. She was a working townswoman in a two-story world of shops, debts, and inheritances. What happened around her over the next decade is not a legend. It is a court file, covered day by the regional press, and it is dark enough on its own. In July 1915, someone in the Relic household set out milk for the two stepsons. The boys did not drink it that morning. Yulka's own daughter did. Sofia Keglevich was 10 years old. She fell ill before noon and was dead by evening. The death was recorded as illness, and a marble cross went up in the Catholic cemetery, with the girl's photograph set into the stone and an inscription that ends. This monument was raised by her mother. In December 1922, Nikola Relic quarrelled with his wife over money, a debt of 14,000 dinars run up on credit. Days later, his shop apprentice would remember, Yulka pressed the morning coffee on him until he drank it. He vomited, took to his bed, and died 6 days later, on Christmas Day. His will left the house and the shop to Yulka, with one condition attached: 50,000 dinars to each son when he turned 18. In December 1923, it was Milivoy's turn to come due. He was 17, a student at the Commercial Academy, and his 50,000 dinars, which his stepmother had lent out and could not easily produce, had to be deposited with the Orphans Board by the 1st of January, his 18th birthday. His guardian later testified that Julka asked for a delay and threatened that otherwise she would deal with her stepson in her own way. On the 13th of December, Milivoy drank his breakfast milk, and by 8 in the morning he was vomiting at school. She brought him home and nursed him herself. When the doctor wanted to return, she turned him away at the door. "He is better." A visitor who came asking was kept out. In those same days, a lawyer was sent for, and a new will was made out in Yulka's favour. The lawyer would remember one detail for the rest of his life and repeat it in court. She handed me the ink with her own hands. Milivoy died at the end of December, after 2 weeks of suffering, 3 days before the birthday that would have made the money his. 3 funerals, 8 years apart, all of them downhill from one woman, and each one followed by paper signed in her favour. This time, the family did not stay quiet. An uncle went to the authorities, and in May 1924, the police came for Julka Relic. She was arrested on the 16th of May 1924, and she denied everything, and she never stopped denying. The investigators went to the cemeteries. Nikola and Milivoy were exhumed first, and the chemists found arsenic in both bodies. In the stepson, the district health chief would testify the dose was enough, as he put it, to destroy the population of an entire street. Then they went back 10 years for little Sophia and found traces even there. Then someone remembered the first husband, dead in Perles in 1914, and they dug him up too. 4 bodies, 4 findings of arsenic. The family crypt of the Relic house was opened so many times that the town began to lose count. By the spring of 1925, the case was regional front-page news, and the press had found its register. On April the 10th, 1925, the big Hungarian-language daily across the county line ran the story under a headline that translates, They are exhuming the victims of the female Landru of Beckerec. The name in that headline belonged to a real man, and in 1925, every newspaper reader in Europe knew exactly who he was. Henri Landru was a French swindler and one of the most famous murderers of the age. He courted lonely widows through newspaper advertisements, promised them marriage, took their savings, murdered them, and burned their bodies in his kitchen stove. His trial in 1921 was a world sensation. The press nicknamed him the French Bluebeard, and the guillotine had taken him only 3 years before this headline. So when a paper called Yulka a female Landru, it was saying, "Here is a woman who does to men what Landru did to women." The biggest borrowed name in crime, handed to a Banat widow. Remember the phrase, "It is about to travel." That April 10th report carried one more scene, stranger than anything the legend ever invented. The commission opened the crypt to exhume Borovoj, the younger stepson, who had died as a child years before, of natural causes as far as any official record went, and who was never charged in the case. His name and his photograph were on the stone. Inside the coffin, they found the skeletons of 2 adults. The child's body was not there at all. The paper printed the fact and could not explain it, and no one ever has. All Beckerec, the report ended, awaits in great excitement. Note what the local press was already doing to the numbers. 3 formal charges, 4 bodies with arsenic findings. By April, print was reaching past them. The first husband too, perhaps others, perhaps 5, perhaps 6. The town had its monster, the crowd had its excitement, and the count had begun to climb. Hold that thought and hold that date, April 1925, because the story was about to leave town. The trial of Julka Relic opened in Beckerec on the 10th of November 1925, and the town treated it as the event of the decade. 3,000 people applied for 300 seats. The court reopened its old grand jury hall to hold the crowd, and on the first morning, the crush at the doors was described by the press as life-threatening. Julka had a new black dress made for the occasion. Reporters wrote that she entered pretty, brown-skinned, in black, startlingly calm, idly picking at her nails while the indictment was read. The prosecution built its case out of the small domestic evidence that poisoning cases live on. The judge asked about rats. There were none in the house, so what was arsenic doing there? Of the daughter, he said, she was seen playing at noon, and by evening, she lay on the bier. Witnesses described a burial shroud that had been sewn in the house in advance, before there was any death to sew it for, though they could not agree whether it had been meant for the husband or the boy. A schoolmate of Milivoj testified that during the boy's illness, Julka told him, "The sick one will die anyway." One witness remembered her saying that Milivoj would surely die because the table had moved in the room, the spirit table of a village séance. One witness recanted her testimony mid-trial and accused the defense of coaching her. Julka's own sister refused to testify at all. The courtroom itself behaved like a theatre. The audience applauded damning testimony and shouted down a witness for the defense. Julka shouted back. At one point, she cried out, "You have all conspired against me to get my money." And a woman in the gallery answered her, "Everyone lies. Only you speak the truth." At another, she turned on the whole room. "This is not a trial, it is a circus." On the last day, the prosecutor rose and gave the crowd what it had come for. "No one witnesses a poisoning," he told the jury. "Poisonings are not committed before witnesses. He called her a woman of great appetite chained to a tired 60-year-old husband. He told the court about the affair she had carried on during the investigation itself with a guard of the Beckerek jail. And he reached for the same borrowed fame the newspapers had reached for. Julka Relic, he said, is a female Landru. Had she not been stopped, he told the court, who knows how many more lives she would have taken. He asked for death by the rope. The defense answered with an argument that lands very strangely 100 years downstream. All of this, counsel said, is gossip dressed as evidence, and the mood in this room was manufactured. It is the newspaper's hunt for sensation, he told the court, that created this atmosphere against the accused woman. The year is 1925, and the man is early. Then Julka stood for her last word. She had been orphaned at 10 herself, she reminded the court. She said of Milivoje, I watched over him. I cared for him. I loved him. And she ended where she had started 18 months before. I am innocent, and I ask to be acquitted. The verdict came on the 17th of November 1925 at 8 in the morning, to a packed hall that the press noted was filled mostly with women. Julka stood strikingly pale. The court found her guilty of the premeditated poisoning of her husband and her stepson. On the death of her daughter Sophia, it acquitted her. The chemistry after 10 years in the ground and the testimony were not enough. The sentence, under the old code, was death by the rope. Asked if she had anything to say, she gave the room one sentence. Nothing. It is all the same to me now. And then, as the guards took her out, she cursed. May God strike down my enemies who brought me to this. A death sentence for a double poisoning, a courtroom circus, a female Landru. You might expect the world's press to pick the story up. Here is the thing. The world's press had already run it. Half a year before the trial opened, in May 1925, while Julka Relic sat in investigative custody denying everything, the newspapers of America had already reported her preliminary hearings, her 35 victims, her labeled cans, and her jealous confession, word for word, under another name. The confession you heard at the top of this video was printed 6 months before the real woman's trial ever began. To understand how that is possible, you have to follow her name as it crosses a continent, one border, and one letter at a time. It started quietly in December 1924, while she was still awaiting trial. The Subotica Daily reported the case, the arrest, the wills, the exhumations. 2 days later, a paper in Miskolc, Hungary, reprinted the item, and in that single reprint, her name appears spelled 2 different ways, Relic and Belix, in the same text. 3 days after that, a paper in Temesvar, in Romania, ran it with the fresh twist of the first husband's exhumation, and there she is, Belix for good. One border crossed, one letter changed. Nobody lied. Somebody transcribed. In April 1925, the exhumation wave made her international. A daily in Graz, Austria, printed a sober dispatch written from Beckerek itself, dated April the 9th. Almost everything in it is accurate. The investigation, the second husband Nikola, the first husband, Matthias Keglevic, innkeeper of Perles, dead in 1914, the Chemical Institute, the 4 suspected family victims. But the surname has mutated again. Relic has become Remick, and one new error is born in this very dispatch. Her dead child is described as her own young son. The real dead child was a daughter Sophia 10 years earlier. Keep your eye on that boy. He has a long journey ahead of him. Then the wire took over, and the wire did not transcribe, it amplified. On April the 18th, a dispatch datelined Prague announced Julie Remick held in Bekarec and credited her with at least 30 poison murders. A Belgrade datelined variant called her simply the Remi, 30 persons poisoned. Within weeks, the story had run through the German language press from Vienna to the Alpine provinces to the Romanian Banat, dozens of printings, 47 in a single archive sweep of those 2 months. One paper reported that the arsenic found in the first husband would have sufficed, it said, to kill an elephant. And on the 3rd of May, a small Austrian paper completed the transformation in a single sentence. The Remick finally confessed to all the poison murders. The real woman had confessed nothing. She never would. The confession was invented somewhere along the wire, between one deadline and the next, and it stuck because a confession is a better story. On the 14th of May, 1925, 5 days before America, a German-language daily in Czernowitz printed the finished legend in an item datelined Temesvar. The headline, "A Female Landru in Yugoslavia." The victim count itemized for the first time. Her 2 husbands, 31 lovers, and her 10-year-old son. She is described as a very beautiful woman of 30. The bodies are in a cellar, in tin barrels, each labelled with the victim's name, his age, and the duration of the affair. 14 of the vanished, it says, were Romanians of the Serbian Banat. And then it prints an interrogation dialogue credited to the Serbian papers, papers no one has ever managed to find. Why did you kill so many innocent people? Out of jealousy. I knew they would soon go to other women, so I told myself it is better that they rest in the cellar of my house. They sleep there quietly, far from any woman. Why did you kill your child? It knew too much. It could have betrayed me. Would you have killed more men had you not been discovered? I believe so. Every organ of the myth is on that page. The jealousy creed that would become, in the internet's shorthand, if I cannot have them, no one will. The labelled containers. The beautiful 30-year-old. The son who knew too much. And one more thing sits on that same page, printed by the same editors, on the same day. The first debunk in history. The paper runs the arithmetic under its own story. If she is 30, that would be 3 murders a year, every year, undetected, and it is difficult, the editors write, to believe the report. The legend and its refutation were born on the same sheet of newsprint. The legend won. 5 days later, the Hearst wires carried it to America, and the last letters fell into place. Remick became Renczi. The Belgrade variant, Remi, became Reniel. At least 30 became an itemized 35. 2 husbands, 32 suitors, 1 son. Bekarec, with a Romanian ending soldered on, became Berkakul. The tin barrels became zinc cans. 11 weeks later, the Sunday supplement performed the christening Vera and made the upgrade the legend deserved. The cans became coffins, the house became a chateau, and a photograph of a woman nobody has ever identified appeared over the caption. There she is, assembled on dated newsprint, letter by letter, border by border. Relic, Belix, Remick, Remi, Renczi, Reniel, Vera Renczi. Nobody conjured the deadliest woman in history out of thin air. They built her, in 5 languages, out of a real widow from Bekarec, and by August of 1925, the copy of a copy of a copy had a name that no archive would ever be able to find. Because under that name, she had never existed. and the real woman. While her phantom toured the world's front pages, Julka Relic lived on in a cell for another decade, and the town's press kept the record. In February 1926, her belongings were auctioned off, and the public came hunting souvenirs of the poisoner. In September 1926, a reporter from the Subotica Daily was allowed to see her on death row, and his interview survives. She came to the visiting room elegant, in a grey flowered gown and smart buckled shoes, and gave her interview readily. She had asked the visiting chief prosecutor, of all things, to hurry her appeal along either way. "I would go dancing and singing to my death," she told the reporter. "I did not kill my husband and my child. If I had, I would not be alive today." 2 years in solitary had worn her down all the same. "I can no longer understand what I read," she said. "My thoughts tangle." Her only visitor was her sister from Pančevo. When the prison offered her the chaplain, she refused him. She had no need, she said, of spiritual comfort. Her standing line to the staff was, "You will see, the truth will yet come out." And to the reporter, at the end, "Rather tomorrow than the day after. The Lord above will be more merciful to my orphaned soul." The appeal was finally heard in Novi Sad in February 1928, and the coverage preserved what she wore. Black silk, head to toe, dress, headscarf, gloves, stockings, and patent shoes. The Black Widow image the world would later invent for Vera, the real woman wore into an appellate courtroom, on the record. She bowed to the judges and wished them good day. The presiding judge confronted her. "Your family members died, one after another, after quarrels with you." "An unfortunate coincidence," she answered. Later that day she broke down, sobbed into her palms and cried out, "Do with me what you want, I am innocent." Her final word to the court was the same logic she had given the reporter. "If I were guilty, I would have poisoned myself too." The next day, the court announced its decision into what the press described as grave-like silence. The death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Her 4 years of investigative custody weighed in the balance. "She heard it," the reporters wrote, with icy indifference, without a single movement of her face. That June, the High Court made it final. She served her life in the fortress prison at Požarevac, and there, in September 1935, she died at 52. The Subotica paper that had covered her for 11 years wrote the obituary under a headline that needs one last translation. "The Jager Mari of the Banat is dead." Jager Mari was Hungary's most famous arsenic poisoner, the shorthand of the age, one more borrowed name to the end. The obituary called her the Witch of the Banat, and it recorded one thing above all, that she had maintained her innocence, in the paper's words, in the most determined manner, to the very end. 11 years from arrest to death, and she never confessed to anyone. Her phantom, meanwhile, has been confessing theatrically, in print, in every language on earth, for 100 years. It is the single loudest difference between them. And notice one last irony. The legend's tellers always explain her survival with the same line. They did not execute women there. It is the one detail the legend got right. The court that sentenced Julka Relic to the rope did not, in the end, hang her. Here is the strangest part. The legend and the real case never met. In the region itself, the phantom name never appeared at all. Not one Vera Renczi in the local press while Julka lived, and not one for the 65 years after, through the whole socialist era. The legend slept in English, in anthologies and encyclopedias of murder. Then the wall came down, and in 1993 she crossed back over. A Prague daily introduced Czech readers to Vera Renczi, the same year a British paperback anthology carried her to a new generation. In 2007, the English Wikipedia article was created, with the impossible birth year in its very first line. From there, the mirrors multiplied. In 2011, Romanian dailies canonized her as national history, crediting a celebrated police writer's catalogue of Romania's 100 most odious criminals. That book exists. She is not in it. The most cited Romanian source for Vera Renczi is a citation to a book that does not contain her. Romania's biggest history magazine then crowned her the country's #1 serial killer, in a ranking that promises, in its own opening lines, that it excluded legend category cases unsupported by proof. It also has her dying in prison at only 32. The real woman it never mentions died at 52. Even the invented death got the age wrong by 20 years. In 2012 came the tabloid supplement and the apology to a living model. In 2024, a peer-reviewed psychiatry journal published a psychobiography of Vera Renczi, building a clinical model of her jealousy from, its own references show, the 1925 Hearst texts and the anthologies downstream of them. The paper concedes, in passing, that the first part of her life is, in its own words, not well proofed. In the 12 months before this video, a Polish state radio podcast asked, in Polish, why the world ever believed the story, and brand new channels retold it straight, one adding that she kept her coffins for decades. On the internet's biggest murder database, she is a row in the index with no page behind it. Even the completists could not build her a file. There is no villain in that chain. A Serbian storyteller who gives her a welcome home dog, a Polish podcast that has her chatting with her victims' ghosts, a Romanian editor ranking a name every reader already knows. Each generation inherited her in good faith from the one before. The tabloids that called her the devourer of lovers were quoting older tabloids. Follow the good faith all the way back and you arrive every time at the same place. A Berlin press bureau in May 1925 and a Sunday supplement 11 weeks later. One byline stands near the source, a young Hearst correspondent who would go on to win the Pulitzer Prize. Whether he invented what he filed, embellished what a stringer sold him, or relayed what the European wire already carried, the page does not say. What the dated record does say is this: the legend was not born in America. It was born on the wire, in Europe, out of a real woman's real case, and America gave it a first name in a bestseller. One more woman belongs in this story. While the world was inventing its Banat poisoner, the Banat had a real one, and she was more terrible than the legend. Her name was Anna Draxin, remembered as Baba Anushka, the old woman of Vladimirovac. She sold what she called magic water to unhappy wives, and the historian who reconstructed her case, the same Belgrade professor who pronounced Vera invented, ties her trade to somewhere between 50 and 150 deaths, documented across the archives of 4 cities and the parish books of the villages. She was arrested in her old age, tried, sentenced to 15 years, released early, and she died at home, an old woman of about 100, in the last years before the war. No chateau, no armchair, no beauty. Just a village, a bottle, and a price. The Banat really was arsenic country. The real record was always dark enough. Almost nobody outside Serbia knows her name, and the whole world knows Vera's. That is the autopsy, the cellar, the 35 coffins, the armchair among the dead. Paper, printed in 1925, refuted on the day it was born, and repeated for a century. Behind the paper, a real courtroom, a real crowd applauding, a real crypt with a child's body missing, a real woman in black silk who told every reporter, every judge, and every guard for 11 years that she was innocent. The court did not believe her. The Wire did not care. It took her town, her arsenic, her dead husbands, and her dead children, made her 30 and beautiful and rich, and gave her a name she had never worn so completely that no one could ever find her again. Vera Renczi is not a serial killer. She is what happens to a woman when the telephone game never stops. And the only Vera who was ever real in this story was an actress who died in 1910 and never hurt anyone. If this is the first time anyone has shown you the documents behind a story you always believed, that is exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe, leave a like, and turn on notifications so the next case file finds you. And in the comments, answer this. What is a fact you have always believed that nobody ever showed you a document for? The Eastern files stay open.